A Night at the Green Horse Inn. It was a cold and wet Monday night in the windy countryside. The only thing it was lacking was thunder and lightning, but it was otherwise an unfortunate hour for anyone to be outdoors. The clouds were dark and grey, and it was almost pitch black, with the moonlight just about shining through to illuminate the minimal amount of roads, the vast mountain-like hills, and the stone walls separating the greenery from the roads. A single Ford Cortina with blinding headlights cautiously drove through the dangerous conditions. Within the warm confines and the presumed safety of the car were Nigel Porter and Hannah Glazer. The two had finally taken time out of their busy schedules and meandering existence to take a holiday, the closest thing to excitement either had experienced since they reached week 37 of being official partners. Forever longing for the initial days of courting consisting of pub crawls, tennis with cocktails, and dinner parties with champagne red wine combinations that made for irreversible liver damage and horrendous hangovers. Nigel, aged 36, was a reserved Londoner with a mild case of undiagnosed attention deficiency disorder. He had a high-paying job that trained him to keep a polite and helpful attitude no matter the situation or the person he was dealing with. He dressed formally regardless of the occasion, whether it be a runway show or relaxing at home. On this particular occasion, he was wearing a white shirt with pale blue stripes, a tweed waistcoat, loose-fitting white jeans with a brown belt, a black overcoat, and he was driving his car with maroon leather driving gloves his father gave him. He had short, dark hair styled a bit like Roger Moore, very thick eyebrows, bright brown eyes, and slightly thick lips like a calf. Hannah Glazer, aged 42, was Nigel's Canadian-born Jewish lover and partner in crime. A fashion designer and self-described unhelpful mathematician, street artist, and punk rocker, she was always willing to lend a hand, even when she was in distress. Although she was easily scared by most things, she was sarcastically witty and a good shoulder to cry on. She absolutely loved animals and cried for hours after watching Bambi for the first time. She had long brown hair with a faint teal-blue streak through the left side, the one thing that helped her feel youthful. She dressed rather casually, in this instance wearing a loose-fitting white shirt with a green tinge, black trousers, brown boots, and a heavy beige overcoat. While Nigel drove the car, Hannah was relaxing with one knee lifted so her foot was resting on the edge of the passenger side seat, holding the map guiding them against her thigh. Hannah was twirling her dyed streak of hair specifically, while Nigel was dead focused on the road, looking as though he was trying not to get the two of them killed. "Do you think we might be lost?" said Hannah. "What makes you say that?" said Nigel with a sigh. "Feels like we've been aimlessly driving for about 32 hours or so. I'm bored, it's dark, I'm cold. I don't think we know where we're going." "What's with the whole we stuff? I'm the one who's driving, dear." "I'm just saying it so neither of us is to blame, that's all." "Well, I think you might be right." Hannah acknowledged a village on the map that she could faintly make out in the darkness of the car. "Well, that's what I've been trying to find," said Nigel. "It's almost as if the roads don't want us to reach it." "Probably," said Hannah. "Do you think they'll be letting in big city strangers this late, though?" Nigel checked his watch. According to his time friend, as he called it, it was only 7:30 in the evening, with Nigel acknowledging they'd be in time to have a drink with the locals if they arrived soon. "It is not 37 at night," said Hannah in confusion. "You're kidding, right? It's blacker than adder out there." Without either Nigel or Hannah noticing, the headlights dimmed ever so slightly before returning to full power not a second and a half later. "You're sure you know where you're going?" asked Hannah. "That's the last time I ask you, I swear." No response. Hannah sighed and rested her head in her hand, using the door's windowsill to hold her head up as she looked out into the darkness aimlessly. After an uncomfortably long and silent period of not saying anything or even acknowledging Hannah had asked him a question, Nigel batted an eye in her direction before looking ahead again. "I'm sorry," said Nigel. "For what?" said Hannah. "Well, a few things. We could have left earlier if I didn't go back over what I'd packed. I could have checked the weather like I was supposed to. We could have done this trip 1 week from now. It would have made no difference, and it would have started much better. So I apologise." Hannah let out a huff and shook her head, relaxing into her seat a little more. She told Nigel it was fine, further expressing her desire to stop somewhere and rest, as well as asking him if he at least remembered to top up the gas tank. "To the brim practically," said Nigel. "As always." "Alright then, at least we have a worst case scenario if you get too tired to drive," said Hannah. "We park on some poor bastard farmer's field, he arrives in his tractor, and we get our brains blown out by a double barrel. But we won't go cold." "I'd rather that didn't happen if I'm entirely honest. I think I'll just promise you that we'll..." While Hannah didn't notice, Nigel trailed off as he noticed the headlights began to dim and flicker a second time. When Hannah finally looked up to see why Nigel wasn't talking anymore, she looked confused and a touch scared by his serious focus on the headlights as they returned to full power just before she could fully see them. "What's the matter?" she asked. Nigel took a moment to reply due to his confusion and focus on the headlights. "Nothing, I thought I saw the headlights flickering," he said. "Are they?" asked Hannah as she sat up to take a look for herself. "Nothing. No, I think I vaguely recognise this based on what the map says." Hannah was unconvinced. "You recognise this part of the country based on what you saw on a crappy map you bought from the library," she said. "Borrowed," Nigel corrected. "Borrowed, fine, but based on that you think what?" "Based on that, there should be some woods nearby this section. We can turn into that and it should lead us to a more populated area." "Are you sure? I don't want to get lost in the woods as well, Nigel." "Well, Hannah, I don't think that'll be a..." For seemingly no reason, despite the petrol dial clearly reading the vehicle was very much almost full, the car began to slow down against Nigel's control, interrupting him and causing him to look at the dial in utter confusion. That'll be a problem," he continued. "What the hell? Are you braking?" asked an equally confused Hannah. "No, I'm going 32, it shouldn't be..." As Nigel trailed off once again, the vehicle continued to slow down, even though the speed on the dial was actually getting faster with Nigel pressing down on the gas repeatedly in a small panic. The headlights began to flicker between bright and dim again, much more quickly and noticeably than the preceding times. Hannah, although she knew the question was fruitless, asked her partner what was going on. "I don't know, maybe the battery's dying," Nigel guessed. "But look at the dial, it says I'm going faster!" The vehicle continued to slow down, almost coming to a stop as the headlights simultaneously flickered and dimmed to the point they almost completely turned off. Nigel made one last attempt at preventing the slowing down by pushing the pedal as hard as he could, shooting the speed of the dial right up to 60. He pressed again, which caused the car to suddenly zoom forwards at unexpected and frightening speed. The headlights turned back up all the way to an impossibly bright level, practically blinding the couple as if they were looking directly at the sun with wide eyes. Nigel struggled due to the blinding brightness of the light, but, after dangerously braking the car and creating a loud screech that created very dark skid marks on the already black road, he finally managed to get the headlights off after fiddling with the switch on the indicator. After taking a second to rub his eyes, Nigel turned the interior light above the rearview mirror on, illuminating the car with a green light which instantly became the normal yellowish colour it always was. Neither Nigel nor Hannah noticed the incredibly brief green light as they were still recovering from what just happened, with Hannah holding a hand to her chest and breathing quite heavily in a state of anxiety. The two of them took a couple of minutes to regain their normal thoughts and calm down. Once they did so, Nigel put his hands back on the wheel. Hannah put her hands down on the dashboard and looked at Nigel, who looked back. They smiled at one another and Hannah began to chuckle out of nervousness. "That was weird," she said. Hannah huffed loudly and Nigel went to turn the headlights on again, then stopped once his hand grabbed the indicator. Hannah looked at him and shared the same level of concern he did. They both said nothing for a moment, with Hannah breaking the silence by asking him if he was sure. Nigel just stared dead ahead into the darkness outside in front of the car. Very cautiously, he flicked the headlights on and they were normal, but with a very slight green tint that neither car inhabitant noticed before the light became a fully normal colour again. Nigel sighed with relief that he was not blinded a second time, setting the car back into drive and continuing their journey at a normal speed with normal, functioning lights. After a few seconds of driving, Nigel went to turn the interior light off. "No, leave it on," said Hannah. "Well, it makes it more difficult to see with that light on," said Nigel. I know, I'm just a little creeped out. So you'd rather I almost crash again? Hannah, unwilling to argue with Nigel's general principles, had nothing to say in response. She simply reached out and turned the light off herself before resting her elbow against the passenger side door's windowsill, holding her knuckles against the side of her head. Nigel focused strictly on the road, already trying to forget about the events that just took place. The wind had settled down, with only occasional strong blows amongst the gentle breeze. The leaves on the trees and the branches they were attached to were naturally affected, almost as if the trees were gently dancing left and right with the wind. The moon shined bright through the dark clouds, illuminating the road in the middle of the woods. The rain had completely stopped. A very faint, distant horse neighing could be heard from within the woods, perhaps that of an escaped livestock. The car began to approach the turning point leading onto the road going through the woods. Nigel flipped the indicator up out of habit, knowing full well not a single car was waiting behind him. As he approached the turning point, a particularly loud and aggressive gust of wind blew against the car. Even though all windows were sealed shut, Hannah physically squirmed after somehow feeling the wind against the back of her neck, like someone was awkwardly rubbing it with their cold fingers without her seeing it coming or realising it was happening until seconds afterwards. Her sudden squirm spooked Nigel, which coincidentally happened at the same time a large tractor suddenly sped out from the woods in front of the couple's car. Hannah shouted at Nigel to look out and the car swerved, but Nigel managed to avoid crashing into the tractor or a tree, as well as avoiding something worse such as the car flipping over. He quickly put the car into park and angrily looked around, but not even faint red taillights from the offending vehicle could be found, almost as if it had disappeared into thin air. Hannah was focusing too much on panting in genuine shock and fear to even notice the tractor was gone. Confused and annoyed as any genuine fear left his body, Nigel settled back into his seat. "Christ, what on earth is going on tonight?" he said in an agitated tone. "Oh God, someone's trying to kill us!" said Hannah as she became more hysterical. "I know it! Someone is actually literally, not none seriously, trying to kill us! Kill you! Kill me! You'll die at the wheel, I'll have a heart attack before anything actually happens!" She calmed down and breathed a little. "God, this is insane!" "It's unlikely, Hannah," said Nigel reassuringly. "I know! I'm just being completely and utterly irrational!" Hannah further breathed and gained more control over her panic. "Is it too late to cancel this whole week?" A little bit, yes," Nigel admitted in a nervous tone. "Okay," said Hannah. "Why don't we drive at 10 miles per hour? That way, we physically, deliberately, literally, and any other word speakingly, so we can avoid any more incidents." Without saying anything, Nigel set the car back into drive, carefully reversed back onto the road, and drove forward before turning into the woods. At Hannah's continued insistence, he kept the speed at 10 miles per hour. "I think that's a pretty good plan you've got there," he finally replied. The couple drove through the creepy woods. The gentle breeze, trees, and leaves continued to make their ominous noises that would have been a lot more enjoyable and relaxing hadn't the setting and events leading up to the woodland drive been so strange. The headlights of the car were the only thing besides the pale light of the moon illuminating the couple's way through the woods. They were no longer flickering between dim and bright. As Nigel continued to drive, however, the engine started to make funny noises, and the headlights started to dim down and flicker between on and off. Nigel and Hannah both gave a confused and worried look. Hannah looked over at Nigel, then ahead at the road, and then at the headlights, watching with dread as they officially began to die out. Although Nigel pressed his foot down against the pedal as hard as he could, the car slowed down and eventually came to a complete halt. Nigel tried turning the key in the engine a few times, but the engine didn't even make a single ear-bending noise. "What's going on?" said Hannah in a panic. Nigel didn't reply, instead silently continuing to try and start the car again, to no avail. "Nigel? Nigel, why won't it turn on? If I knew, I wouldn't be aimlessly trying to turn it back on, would I?" said Nigel. "All right, don't get snappy. I'm not, I'm just..." Nigel gave up trying to argue, huffed, and rubbed his face with his hands out of stress. "We're going to have to go out and look at the engine," he said in dismay. "You remember to put the flashlight in the trunk, right?" "No, I left them in the cellar." For God's sake, I told you to—
Jesus, I was kidding, Nigel!
snapped Hannah. Of course I put them in the trunk. Although Nigel was in no mood for jokes, he understood it was simply part of Hannah's nature and nervousness, putting aside any anger he would have had. All right then, said Nigel. Should we— I don't want to go out there, said Hannah. It's dark, cold, and there's probably an 1800 serial killer with a rusty scythe out there. You can stay in the car if you'd like, but I think it'll be a quicker process for both of us if we both get out there. Hannah said nothing. She tried turning the interior light on, which sparked once for a split second before immediately turning off again, spooking them both. Jesus Christ! She cried in a hump. I don't want to be in this car anymore either, to be honest. Nigel undid his seatbelt and pulled his gloves further down his wrists. There's something strange going on, he said. We can't sit here all night, can we? Nigel opened his door a little while looking at Hannah, who just stared ahead, frozen in fear and consideration of what to do next. Nigel opened the door a little more and put his foot on the road, still looking at Hannah. With some reluctance, she took his silent prompting and undid her belt, opened the passenger side door, and jumped out of the car. In response, Nigel brought his foot inside and closed the door as a tease. Hannah, annoyed, leaned back into the car and gave Nigel a death stare. This caused him to uncontrollably start chuckling, taking his keys and getting out of the car as he repeatedly assured Hannah he was getting out, gently slamming the door shut behind him. Hannah shut her door as well, with the two of them walking around the car to meet at the trunk. Nigel manually unlocked it using his keys and opened it up. There were various things inside, including 2 flashlights, 2 jerry cans of extra gas, and camping equipment such as a tent, a cooker, and a cooler. Nigel pocketed his keys, reached into the trunk, and dug around for the flashlights, uncovering one that he immediately handed to Hannah. While Nigel dug around for the other one, Hannah tried turning her flashlight on, but it wouldn't light, so she got a little antsy, frowning as she shook it and looked into the bulb. It turned on suddenly, causing her to recoil with light-blinded eyes. Nigel pulled out the other flashlight, which turned on with one press of the button. This annoyed Hannah, who was still blinking and rubbing her eyes from the physical shock of the brightness. Nigel closed the trunk and walked around towards the front of the car, with Hannah following as she continued to recover. Nigel lifted the hood of the car and used the light from his flashlight to inspect the engine. "Shine yours there, please," he said. Hannah aimed her light where Nigel's was. He turned his light off and held it out for Hannah to take. She didn't notice at first, so he batted his eyes in her direction and shook the flashlight a little. Hannah caught on and took it from him. After she quietly apologised, Nigel began to inspect the engine. "There's nothing wrong with it as it seems," said Nigel. "It hasn't overheated or blown. It's perfectly fine, really. For some reason it just isn't working." Hannah was completely befuddled and had no idea what to make of the statement, questioning Nigel's and her own sanity in her head. "What kind of sense does that make?" she said. "None," Nigel replied. "All I can tell you is that it looks like we're stuck here for the night." "Really? Well, what do we do, freeze to death and bury ourselves?" "I suggest we start a fire. We have most of the resources, but all we need is the wood. If anyone comes by, they'll see the light of the fire and we can flag them down." "Okay," said Hannah as she stepped away from the engine. "Should I go and find some?" "Oh, no, I don't like that," said Nigel as he nervously stepped in to stop her. "I'll go and then we'll look at the map when I get back, try and see how far we are. Maybe we can walk the rest of the way if it isn't too much of a distance." Nigel took his flashlight back and started feeling around in his overcoat pockets to find something. Finding nothing, he switched to his trouser pockets for the thing, instead coming across his lighter in his right trouser pocket and his wallet in the left. He eventually recovered what he was looking for in the inner right pocket of his overcoat, a small pocket knife, which he handed to Hannah. He then grabbed his keys from his inner left overcoat pocket and gave them to her as well. "Guard the car," he said. "If anything happens, lock yourself inside." Nigel walked into the woods with his flashlight at the ready. Hannah studied the knife and began to feel overconfident, gripping it firmly, smirking, and nodding slightly as she assured herself she could guard the car with no problems. Almost immediately afterwards, her flashlight began to fail again, irritating her. She started shaking it, but it faded out completely as opposed to brightening up again. She went to look directly at the bulb but stopped herself, speedily blinking a few times as she remembered the blinding discomfort she experienced moments ago. Further into the woods, Nigel looked around for firewood. He came across a small stack of sticks, taking them in his hands. He shined the light around the woods between the various trees, finding another few sticks by a large tree, walking over to them and crouching down to grab them. He slowly aimed the light in the direction the noise came from, but could not see anything unusual. He continued to suspiciously look for a few more seconds, then turned back and focused on the sticks again, picking them up. He began to walk back to the car before hearing the rustling of sticks and leaves, as if someone was running nearby. He looked in the direction the noise was coming from with his light, but once again saw nothing. He shined the light towards a tree where he caught the outline of a figure before it retreated behind it. Confused, curious, and full of fear, Nigel slowly approached the tree. He stopped not too far away and began to lean to the side to hopefully catch a glimpse of the figure. He attempted to get the figure's attention by greeting them, eventually shining the light on the figure to reveal them to be short and completely covered by a cloak. Within seconds of them sensing the light, they darted off deeper into the woods. "Wait!" Nigel cried. He chased the figure deeper into the woods, only to quickly lose them as the sound of their running completely stopped. Nigel then stopped running as well, and near complete silence returned. "Hello?" he said. "We need some assistance. Our car's broken down." Without Nigel noticing, a root protruded from the ground and dug its head back into it before solidifying like a rock, leaving a perfect spot for someone to stick their foot under it and trip over. A twig snapped, followed by the figure running past some trees back towards the road. Nigel turned in the direction the figure was speeding in and caught them in the light. The figure stopped and turned to face Nigel for a split second, revealing a young, feminine face riddled with fear. As soon as they turned their back to him once again, they continued to run away. "Wait! My partner Hannah is that way! Nigel caught his foot under the root, tripped over and landed hard on the ground, smashing the flashlight so hard that the bulb blew. The sticks he gathered fell all over the place, making his efforts pointless. Back by the car in the middle of the road, Hannah, not having heard Nigel's attempts to call out to the figure, was leaning against the trunk, looking around aimlessly as she waited for her partner to return. The sound of the figure running through the woods towards the road started to get louder, which caused Hannah to hear it. She squinted her eyes as she looked deeper into the shadows. "Nigel? Why are you running?" she asked in confusion. Her eyes widened when she realised the sound of the shoes wasn't familiar. "Is someone—" The figure sprinted out of the woods and onto the road, stopping in front of the car and looking directly at Hannah, who looked back at them with confusion and fear. Taking a chance by pressing the button on her flashlight, Hannah managed to turn it on and illuminate the figure for just a second, revealing them to be a youthful female with straw blonde hair, pale skin, and dark green eyes. The female was immediately spooked and ran into the other side of the woods. Hannah's flashlight once again ceased to work after the female ran away. "Hey!" yelled Hannah with a shaky voice. Within seconds, the female figure disappeared. Hannah ran out onto the road to continue to watch them before finally realising the implications of Nigel still being gone. She turned to the side of the woods that her partner disappeared into, hitting her flashlight in the palm of her hand with such force that it turned back on, allowing her to shine the light into the woods. "Nigel? Nigel!"